This empire controlled nearly 25% of the world's economy, the largest concentration of wealth in human history. Its treasury was fed by taxes from 3 continents and trade routes that controlled prices across the known world. Grain shipments decided whether cities ate. Silver coins decided whether armies marched. Every major market moved according to one system. Then control of this system passed to one individual, a ruler with total authority over spending, total authority over taxation, and total authority over currency. What followed was not chaos, it was policy. Step by step, the flow of money began to change, not because the system was weak, but because it was being used differently. And once the movement of money shifts, everything built on it shifts as well. The man who took control of this system was not an outsider. He was born inside power. Nero grew up surrounded by wealth, privilege, and fear. From an early age, he learned one lesson well. Control mattered more than competence. When he became ruler, he didn't inherit chaos, he inherited order. The treasury was full. The tax system worked. The currency was trusted. The army was loyal because it was paid on time. In theory, Nero only needed to preserve the system. But Nero didn't see an economy. He saw an extension of himself. Public money felt distant, abstract, like something that would always refill itself. He wanted admiration, spectacle, permanence, and those things cost money. At first, nothing broke. That's what makes this part dangerous. The markets didn't panic. The coins didn't collapse. The system absorbed his choices quietly. And that silence convinced Nero of something fatal, that the economy existed to serve his will. Advisors became obstacles. Restraint felt unnecessary. Limits felt insulting. Power without resistance creates confidence. Confidence without understanding creates risk. Because once a ruler stops respecting how money moves, money starts reacting in ways rulers can't control. Rome was still standing. The treasury was still functioning. But the logic guiding it had changed. And in financial history, that shift is never harmless. Rome worked because money moved with precision. Taxes didn't arrive randomly. They arrived on schedule. From farms, ports, mines, and markets spread across 3 continents. Grain shipments flowed into the city in massive quantities, not as charity, but as policy. Food supply stabilized prices. Stable prices kept cities calm. Calm cities meant predictable revenue. Silver coins circulated without resistance. Merchants accepted them without bargaining. Soldiers trusted them without hesitation. That trust was the system. The treasury didn't feel dramatic because it wasn't meant to. It was designed to be boring, consistent, and reliable. Wages were paid when promised. Contracts were honored without renegotiation. And because the rules rarely changed, markets adjusted themselves around them. Trade routes didn't just exist. They depended on Roman predictability. Ships sailed because returns could be calculated. Investments were made because risk was limited. Rome didn't need to announce its power. Its economy announced it daily. When provinces were taxed, they adapted. Producers adjusted output. Merchants adjusted pricing. The system absorbed pressure because pressure was expected, not sudden. This is how large economies survive. Not by avoiding strain, but by managing it slowly. The army played its role quietly. Pay arrived on time. Supply lines stayed open. Loyalty didn't need speeches when salaries were predictable. Every part of the empire moved because it was connected to payment. From the outside, the scale looked overwhelming. From the inside, it felt routine. And routine creates confidence. Confidence that the currency would hold. Confidence that policy wouldn't swing wildly. Confidence that tomorrow would look like today. That confidence allowed Rome to operate at massive scale without friction. Money didn't rush, it flowed. And because it flowed steadily, the system appeared endless, which meant changes didn't look dangerous at first. Small adjustments blended into normal operations. Additional expenses disappeared into large budgets. Higher demands were absorbed by established revenue streams. Nothing broke. Nothing stalled. And because nothing reacted immediately, the idea that the system required restraint began to fade. The treasury still paid. Markets still functioned. Trade still moved. The economy kept going, quietly adjusting to pressures that hadn't yet revealed themselves. Nero's first dangerous decision was not madness. It was arrogance. He looked at Rome's treasury and didn't see responsibility. He saw availability. An economy built over generations was treated like a personal credit line. Public money stopped being public the moment Nero decided his image mattered more than restraint. He didn't ask whether the empire could afford his ambitions. He assumed it could. The spectacle came first. Games grew larger. Rewards became louder. Spending turned theatrical. None of it strengthened trade. None of it protected supply. None of it stabilized prices. It only fed ego, and Nero demanded more. To fund this appetite, he made his second decision, a deliberate one. He pushed revenue pressure outward. Taxes were tightened where voices were weakest. Provinces that produced wealth but lacked power were squeezed harder and faster. From Rome, this looked efficient. From the provinces, it felt predatory. Nero didn't care. As long as money arrived in the capital, the method didn't matter. But money doesn't behave like obedience. It reacts. Merchants didn't protest. They adapted. They rerouted trade. They reduced exposure. Capital didn't fight back. It quietly stepped away. These were early warnings, clear warnings. Nero ignored them. That was his third most dangerous decision, to silence caution. Advisors who spoke of limits were dismissed. Restraint was framed as weakness. Discipline was treated like disloyalty. If the treasury still paid, Nero saw no problem. If markets still functioned, Nero saw confirmation. This is how reckless power justifies itself. Every time the system absorbed pressure, Nero believed it could absorb more. Every adjustment reinforced his confidence. Every silence convinced him that resistance didn't exist. The economy wasn't failing fast enough to scare him, so he pushed harder. Spending increased. Taxes tightened. Warnings vanished. Rome's finances stopped being managed and started being exploited. The most dangerous part wasn't the cost. It was the mindset. Once Nero decided the economy existed to serve his desires, every future decision followed the same logic. If money was needed, it would be taken. If trust was strained, it would be ignored. If pressure built, it would be forced to adapt. And the system did adapt. Again and again, until adaptation stopped being strength and started becoming exhaustion. But Nero didn't see exhaustion. He saw obedience, and he demanded more. It started as a fire, but it didn't stay a fire for long. Whole districts burned, not monuments. Markets, not palaces, warehouses, not symbols, supply. Stored grain disappeared. Inventory vanished overnight. Housing for workers collapsed into ash. This wasn't cultural damage. This was economic destruction. Rome's economy depended on flow. The fire stopped it. Goods that were supposed to move through the city never reached markets. Laborers lost homes and scattered. Prices didn't wait for permission. They reacted immediately. Shortages appeared first. Then panic buying. Then pressure. And this happened on top of a system already stretched thin. The treasury was already being abused. Reserves were already thinner than they looked. Flexibility was already disappearing. The fire removed what little margin remained. Nero's response made it worse. Instead of slowing spending, he accelerated it. Instead of stabilizing supply, he focused on rebuilding image. Reconstruction became obsession. Massive projects were announced immediately. Costs were not calculated. Limits were not discussed. Public money was unleashed at scale. Emergency spending exploded. Materials were seized. Labor was redirected. None of this was planned. All of it was reactive. The economy was forced to respond faster than it could recover. Money was pushed into circulation aggressively. Demand spiked without supply. Prices followed. The treasury absorbed the shock at first. That absorption looked like strength. It wasn't. Every emergency payment reduced reserves. Every rushed contract increased pressure. Every rebuild decision locked the system into higher ongoing costs. And Nero demanded speed, not stability, not balance. Speed. The city had to rise again, immediately, visibly, impressively. That urgency ignored how economies heal. Supply takes time. Trust takes longer. Rome was being rebuilt faster than it could breathe. Markets adjusted, but not cleanly. Merchants raised prices. Speculators moved in. Confidence started fracturing at the edges. The system was still functioning, but it was no longer comfortable. Money was moving faster, under more stress, with less control. And the person demanding the most from it was the same person who had already pushed it too far. The fire didn't end when the flames died down. It moved into the numbers. Rebuilding demanded money faster than Rome had ever released it before. Emergency spending didn't just increase, it dominated every decision. The treasury wasn't planning anymore, it was reacting. Payments were approved for speed, not sustainability, and that distinction matters more than rulers ever admit. To keep money moving, the system reached for the easiest lever: currency. Silver coins didn't disappear, they multiplied. The problem was what was inside them. Less silver, more filler. Same face, same promise, different reality. This wasn't announced. It never is. More coins entered circulation to meet immediate demand, but value doesn't expand just because quantity does. Prices adjusted first. Grain cost more. Housing rose sharply. Daily necessities reacted faster than wages ever could. Inflation doesn't need permission. People noticed, not in speeches, not in revolts, but in markets. The same coin bought less food. The same wage covered fewer needs. Confidence didn't collapse, but it tightened. And when confidence tightens, spending behavior changes. The Treasury felt it next. Emergency reserves that once existed as protection were now routine funding. What had been a buffer became baseline. There was no margin left to absorb another shock, and pressure didn't stop there. The army depended on predictability, not bonuses, not promises, predictability. Pay began to arrive late. Supplies were delayed. Contracts were renegotiated downward. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just enough disruption to make loyalty conditional. Soldiers didn't rebel immediately, they waited. Merchants didn't panic immediately, they adjusted. Provinces didn't revolt immediately, they recalculated. This is how financial damage spreads, quietly, rationally, without announcement. Money was still moving, but it was moving differently. Faster where it shouldn't, slower where it mattered. The system began prioritizing urgency over stability, survival over structure. Nero didn't see failure. He saw resistance. To him, the answer wasn't restraint, it was force. If money wasn't enough, more would be created. If trust weakened, authority would replace it. If costs rose, pressure would increase somewhere else. That logic never fixes an economy. It exhausts it. The cracks weren't wide yet, but they were everywhere, in markets that no longer priced calmly, in soldiers who no longer trusted schedules, in a treasury that no longer planned beyond the next demand. Rome was still standing. But its finances were no longer breathing freely. They were being compressed. And compressed systems don't warn you when they're about to give way. Rebellion didn't start with shouting, it started with silence. When payments stopped arriving on time, loyalty stopped being guaranteed. Soldiers didn't revolt immediately, they waited. Delays were noted. Supplies arrived late. Wages were adjusted without explanation. Not enough to spark outrage, just enough to create doubt. Doubt is dangerous. Provincial governors felt the pressure next. They were expected to enforce order and send revenue to Rome, while support from the center weakened. Authority without money is fragile. Orders still went out, but obedience slowed. Some regions complied out of habit. Others began calculating alternatives. Merchants followed the same logic. They reduced exposure. They avoided risk. They stopped trusting guarantees that depended on a treasury already under strain. Trade didn't collapse, it tightened. The system was still standing. But loyalty had become conditional. Nero responded the only way he knew how, with force. Pressure increased instead of restraint. Demands grew instead of discipline. He treated hesitation as defiance and caution as betrayal. That response accelerated everything. And when money can no longer buy loyalty, power tries to replace it. And power is always more expensive. Rumors spread faster than orders. That Rome was weakening, that payments would worsen, that alignment with the center carried more risk than reward. No single rebellion mattered on its own. What mattered was coordination. When confidence disappears at multiple edges at the same time, control becomes theoretical. Rome was still issuing commands. But fewer people were listening, and the distance between authority and obedience was growing. Power didn't leave Nero all at once. Support did. He still sat on the throne. Orders were still issued. Coins still carried his face. But fewer people acted on what they heard. Advisors stopped arguing, not because they agreed, but because disagreement had become dangerous. Silence replaced counsel. When leaders stopped hearing bad news, they stopped seeing reality. Nero mistook that silence for loyalty. The Senate complied on paper and distanced itself in practice. Decrees were passed slowly. Responsibility was avoided. Everyone understood where the risk now lived, close to the emperor. The army followed the same pattern. Units remained in place, but enthusiasm disappeared. Orders were obeyed carefully, selectively, without urgency. Loyalty held, but only as long as alternatives were unclear. Provincial leaders began acting independently, not openly, quietly. Decisions were delayed, revenues were retained longer. Local stability mattered more than imperial demands. This wasn't rebellion yet, it was insulation. Nero responded by tightening control. More commands, more pressure, more suspicion. He demanded affirmation instead of trust, obedience instead of confidence. That only accelerated the withdrawal. The closer Nero pulled power toward himself, the fewer people were willing to stand near it. Influence shrank, information narrowed. Reality filtered itself before reaching the top. An emperor surrounded by silence is not secure. He is exposed. Rome still functioned, but it no longer moved together. Decisions were fragmented, responses slowed, coordination weakened. Nero had authority without connection, power without reinforcement, command without commitment. And in systems like Rome's, isolation doesn't announce collapse, it prepares it. The break came when authority stopped pretending. The Senate didn't debate, it calculated. Nero was no longer a stabilizing force, he was a liability. Supporting him now meant sharing the risk of a system already under strain, so distance became policy. Messages stopped carrying urgency, orders were delayed. Responsibility was quietly shifted away from the center. Power was still referenced, but no longer relied on. The army made the decision that mattered most. Loyalty had already weakened under delayed pay and uncertain supply. Now it vanished. Commanders chose survival over symbolism. They refused to move. They refused to enforce. Some units openly declared support for alternatives. Others simply stepped aside. That silence was decisive. Without the army, authority collapsed in practice. Nero still held the title, but nothing responded to it. The machinery of the state moved without him. Provincial leaders followed the same logic. Taxes were withheld. Orders were ignored. Stability was protected locally, not centrally. Alignment with Nero became a risk no one wanted to carry. The economy reacted instantly. Markets froze. Confidence evaporated. Money that once moved on imperial guarantee stopped moving at all. What broke Rome at this moment wasn't violence. It was abandonment. Power requires participation, and participation had ended. Nero was no longer overthrown. He was left behind. Rome didn't fall in a single moment. It stopped functioning. Orders from the capital carried no weight. Provinces acted on their own calculations. Taxes stopped moving inward. Authority moved outward. The center emptied. The army no longer defended the system. Units chose alignment based on survival, not loyalty. Borders weakened, not because of invasion, but because coordination vanished. Rome could no longer project power beyond its immediate reach. Markets froze. Trade slowed to a crawl. Contracts backed by imperial authority lost meaning. When guarantees disappear, commerce follows. The economy that once connected continents fractured into local systems. The treasury was irrelevant now, not empty, irrelevant. Money without trust is just metal. Payments couldn't restore loyalty. Spending couldn't restore confidence. Rome still existed as a city, but Rome as a system was gone. Administration broke down. Supply chains fragmented. Decision-making became regional, then personal. What had once been unified under a single economic logic splintered beyond repair. This wasn't destruction by enemies. It was collapse by misrule. The empire didn't lose territory first. It lost control. And once control disappeared, everything built on it followed. Silently, rapidly, permanently. Rome didn't burn to the ground in this moment. It hollowed out, and hollow systems don't recover. Power disappeared faster than Nero could understand it. One moment he was issuing commands. The next, no one was answering. Guards vanished first, not dramatically. Quietly, posts were left unattended. Doors that once opened instantly stayed closed. Loyalty didn't break in anger. It dissolved in fear. Nero tried to assert authority. The title still existed. The response didn't. Messages were sent. No confirmations returned. Allies were named. None appeared. The network that once carried his will across the empire had collapsed into silence. Money was useless now. The treasury he had drained could not buy protection. Promises carried no value when the system behind them was gone. He was forced to move. Not as an emperor, but as a liability. The palace that symbolized unlimited power became a trap. Staying meant capture. Leaving meant exposure. Every choice narrowed. Nero fled Rome without ceremony, without escort, without confidence. The same man who once controlled markets, armies, and provinces now depended on secrecy and speed. Fear replaced authority. Panic replaced command. This was not a fall from grace. It was a collapse of relevance. An emperor without loyalty is not overthrown. He is irrelevant. And in those final hours, Nero understood something too late. Power does not disappear when you lose the throne. It disappears when no one believes you can protect them anymore. Nero was gone. The damage remained. The treasury was exhausted, not empty, exhausted. Trust in currency had weakened. Payments that once guaranteed loyalty no longer carried weight. The army was fragmented. Administration was slow and uneven. Provinces operated independently, focused on survival, not unity. Rome did not reset overnight. Systems don't heal just because one man disappears. Confidence takes longer to rebuild than power takes to lose. What followed was an immediate recovery. It was stabilization at a lower level. The empire continued. But it continued smaller, weaker, and more cautious. The cost of Nero's decisions wasn't paid in his final hours. It was paid long after, by an empire that had already lost what mattered most.